Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming out on I say coming out, sitting in, I guess we should say, on a rather lovely Sunday to hear about this program. And I have to admit, when I first heard about Citizen Initiative, I'm like, oh God, no, no, not in this climate. No, 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 no. But since I didn't know much about it, I did some research, and I have to say, my skepticism is starting to go away. So I
Yay.
hope, well, my first thought was, oh my God, not in this climate. But
Mhm.
so the more I've studied it, the more I'm softening, and I appreciate everybody for bringing this idea to our attention. I'm going to drop into chat the file that has all the data. And if you put your questions in the chat, we will get to them at the end. So we are fortunate to have with us today Elaine from Maryland, LWV Maryland, who worked on their study. And so I'm going to hand this over to Trish Weidmeyer, who brought this attention to us, and she's going to introduce our speaker and get the ball rolling. So thank you all. And Trish, it's all yours.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I started thinking about citizen initiatives after the 2024 legislative session. I'm a member of the Campaign Finance Reform Issue Group, and we saw all of our campaign finance bills just killed, even though we had had a change in party leadership in the House, and we thought that we were in good shape for some of them. So what I have done is written a brief preface that sort of explains more about when citizen initiatives are useful. And it's just a one page of text and this table. And so the table illustrates three points that I want to make before I introduce Elaine. One, you'll notice that the topics here, this is the results of public polls, and the topics are not random. I chose them because they have been targets for league advocacy, in some cases for years. And the second thing to notice is that when you look at how public feels about these things on which we have our positions, the public agrees with us. So there is nothing that could be claimed to be radical or extreme in the positions that the league takes on these topics. And then the third thing to know about these topics, campaign finance reform, reproductive freedom, gun safety, restoration of voting rights. This is for people who have been convicted of felonies. They have now finished serving their sentences, and they have to go through a sort of arbitrary application in order to be able to vote again. Um, so the other thing to notice about these is these things have all been advocated by the league and other groups such as Nancy Morgan's group for several years. And yet the General Assembly has remained relatively unresponsive to them. In some cases, for campaign finance reform, over 20 years, the league has been advocating to get contribution limits. Now, 45 other states, the legislatures have somehow managed to to pass campaign fund contribution limits, and it cannot pass in Virginia. Restrict personal use of campaign funds. This appears to be opposed by by leaders of both political parties. And these others, abortion, legality of same-sex marriage, and restoration of voting rights would require constitutional amendments. It's a relatively lengthy process. It was just discussed, these three amendments in a meeting last week of the Privileges and Election Committee of the House. There is not bipartisan support for these, so they presumably will pass in the 2025 session. But then if there is a change in party control, we will be back to square one in terms of trying to get them passed. So at some point you begin to think, well, what would happen if the voters given how they feel, how Virginians feel about these topics, what would happen if the voters could just go ahead and vote on these things and we bypass the General Assembly? And that brings us to citizens initiatives. And I'd like now to stop. How do I get that? Stop sharing. Yeah. And turn this over to Elaine, and let me tell you just a few things I've learned about Elaine. First of all, she joined the league in 1974, which means she's a lifer. Congratulations, Elaine, 50 years of league membership. That's great. She has been on the league, state league board of directors for 6 years. 2 of those years, she was a co-president. She's also been a co-president of her local league, which is Montgomery County. And she has been a member of the U.S. League Lobby Corps. Elaine is here because she was the chair of the study committee that looked at the topic of citizens initiatives, and they wrote a very, very balanced review of it and published a position supporting the league consequently published support for a citizen initiative in 2021, so recently. And so I hope you all get a chance to read what their study had to say. And if not, she's going to tell you some of the overview of the pros and cons of the initiatives today. Thanks, Elaine.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for having me. So I will start and I will share my slides. So, what we will talk about a little bit today will be the background and some of the definitions, lots of definitions, but don't get bogged down by them. An important thing will be the key practices. And then I have quickly looked at Virginia. I'm hoping if any of you are in the areas that have the initiative process locally, you will participate. And then we'll look at the Maryland consensus questions and the actual consensus because it's a one-page. It is not very, very involved. What we did was in Maryland was in 2019, what happened to us is we were very frustrated with redistricting. We had redistricting problems, and we looked around, and the states that had the initiative process were the ones that at least could get it on the ballot and be voted on by the citizens of the state. And we were very frustrated. In fact, we ended up before the Supreme Court for one of our districts with North Carolina. And of course, it was thrown back to the states. No, nothing was resolved. But this is what brought on our study of the initiative process. And what the initiative process does is it allows voters to participate, and I'm going to do this, whoops, to participate directly in placing a piece of legislation or even a constitutional amendment on the ballot, usually through a petition process, and this literally circumvents the legislature. It's allowed in over 26 states. Maryland, we have a veto referendum, and we'll talk about initiative and referendum. We didn't discuss much about referendum in Maryland because we have the veto referendum, but Virginia does not have this. And so voters in Maryland can pass something that can veto legislation that was passed by the Maryland legislature. But we cannot initiate legislation. And the Virginia voter can either initiate or they don't have initiative or referendum power. And so that our state study. Okay, as I said, 26 states have some form of the initiative process. The last state to do this was in 1992, and that was Mississippi. The first one was in South Dakota in 1898, over 100 years ago. And initiatives can be legislative, laws, or constitution, changes in the Constitution. Interestingly enough, in 2019, bills were pursued in Hawaii, New York, Tennessee, Wisconsin, and New Jersey. None were passed. That was 2019. I went to update that, and guess what? Nothing has still passed since Mississippi in 1992. Okay, what are the initiatives? There are two forms of initiatives, and both of these can be legislative or constitutional. We have the direct initiative, and this issue is presented directly to the voters, and it takes effect without any action by the legislature or the governor. It gets on the ballot, usually through a petition process. But there's also an indirect initiative. This is a little less, shall we say, drastic. And what it is there's a petition that goes on, but the issue is then submitted to the legislature. If the legislature does not take action or rejects it in a particular amount of time, then the issue goes back to the voters, and the voters can then vote on it and take action. All right, there are two other types that we don't hear too much about, and I'll just throw them in to confuse you more. There's the advisory. That is, it throws out an initiative, but it is non-binding, meaning that the legislature kind of just feels like, let's know how you feel about it. Gambling sometimes. In Maryland, that came out as an advisory initiative, meaning that it has no effect on the state laws, and the legislature is not pressured to do anything about it. It's just a popularity contest, basically. And then the other is a general policy one, which I haven't seen used too much because it really doesn't make too much sense. But it throws out an idea of, say, are the voters interested in gambling, but it has no specific legislation connected with it. And supposedly, if they say yes, it's very similar to advisory, really. If they say yes, then it's the legislature that has presumably said they will act on it one way or the other. All right. We get to referendum. And as I said, Maryland did not take this on too much, but I'm going to throw it out because Virginia does not have the referendum. A constitutional referendum, and this we all have, is that if there's a change in the Constitution, it must go back to the voters to reject or approve it. In other words, Maryland cannot have a change in the Maryland Constitution without an approval of the voters. A legislative referendum is two things. Legislatures can approve or reject a bill and then refer it to the voters, and they will either uphold it or repeal the legislation. So they have the last say, basically, in it. A veto referendum, and this is what Maryland has, is if we do not like a law, we can petition to actually put the law on the ballot to be retained or nullified. But basically, referendum comes from the word refer. Something has already happened and by the legislature, and it's referred back to the voters. That's different from being initiated by the voters. And here's a good map of exactly how many states have the initiative process and what kind of process. If it's blue, they can initiate statutes and constitutional amendments. The green are just initiate statutes only. That would be laws. Two states, and one is Maryland, have that referendum only. In other words, we have to reject or deny a constitutional amendment, and we can do that veto referendum. We're saying with enough petitions, we want to get rid of a law. Okay, initiated amendments only, which is interesting to the Constitution. That's just 3 states. And then the rest of the states have no initiative or referendum. And of course, Virginia is one of those states. If you look at that map, do you see where most of the states with that initiative and referendum are? They're in the West Coast, right? Middle to west, right. Okay, that's because about the turn of the century, and remember South Dakota was the first one in 1898, there was the progressive movement because the West was fighting the railroads, the domination of the railroads and the oil and the gas and some of those. And those owners, those giants were really pressuring the legislation and were putting a lot of legislation in that was good for them, but not always good for the public. And so this is where the initiation process, the initiative process really started taking hold. And it took hold in most of those progressive Western states. The East was pretty much more conservative. The legislatures were more established and in place. And they said, no way can you mess around with our power. And we're not going to give you that initiative power or referendum. Okay. We talked about direct and indirect initiative, and I'm going to specifically go with those two, and then we're going to look at the initiative process in general. But in a direct initiative, that means it goes directly to the voters and it's a yay or no. It's definitely faster than the legislative process. And most of these, the pros and cons are going to be exact opposites of each other. The con in that is that because it's faster than the legislative process, it does not involve that legislative process. So in many cases, especially at the beginning of the initiative, when they first started, it lacked that process of hearings. It lacked fiscal impact. It lacked a lot of the things that even though the legislative process is slow, there are advantages to that, almost like checks and balances in some ways. The indirect process, which we don't hear about as often, is in this case, there is a specific role for the legislature. So even though the public says they want something, it goes back to the legislature, and there it can include those steps, such as the hearings and the physical reports and things like that. And the con is, the people will say, yes, we want it. Yes, it's gone back. And they say, who cares? We're not going to do anything about it anyway. So, all right, before I do that, because I don't want just me talking, are there any questions as far as the definition or the differences between indirect, direct, constitutional, a legislative so far?
Well, there's one sort of, Carolyn is asking, and I guess this is an answer to direct or indirect. Bills go to the DLS, right? The Division of Legislative Services to be crafted. So if you're doing a direct initiative, there is no crafting, right? It's just whatever you have to, the group has to craft it.
That's correct. And we'll get a little further on, we'll see the mitigating legislation that attempts to solve that. But that's one of the key things is, especially at the beginning, and I will say very quickly is, the reason I joined the League of Women Voters is I moved to California and there were 32 ballot questions on my first California election. And I said, what in the world am I talking about? And they said, go to a League of Women Voters meeting and they'll tell you. And they were right. And I knew exactly what I was voting on and never left the league. But yes, at the beginning, especially, and even in some, depending upon the state laws, it's crafted by who's ever putting that legislation on. And if it does not go through all kinds of reviews and things, what happens is it eventually goes into the courts, and we'll get into that. But yes,
Okay.
good point. Okay, now let's look at the advantages of the initiative. And of course, the first one is, and it's what Trish said at the very beginning, the ability of citizens to pursue an action supported by a majority of voters. And a lot of times, especially in this day and age, the legislators and the voters are not on the same track at all. And they're kind of deaf sometimes to voters' ears. So that is definitely a positive. As we said, it's faster if you really want to push something through. That is very, very important and time related. It bypasses or puts pressure on the legislature. So a lot of times with the initiative process, sometimes it's found that if they see a swell coming up on a legislative initiative, sometimes the legislatures will act ahead of that being put on the ballot. So sometimes there is pressure on the legislature to say, hey, listen to us, or we're going to put this on the ballot. And then we have some other things that I think are very interesting. They found it can increase voter participation. If you're really interested in a topic, abortion is a good one, women's rights, redistricting has been one, the environment. People will get excited and active and say, we need to do something. And they're going to all of a sudden be interested in this voting process that they might have sat back on before. Also, it increases coalitions. People that might not work together for a certain topic. It also supposedly increases voter turnout because, again, if reproductive rights is on that ballot, you know, and there are women that really this is important to them, or something on the environment, they're going to come out and vote, and then hopefully they will vote on the rest of the ballot, or at least become interested in who else is on the ballot. Um, and this going to go both ways. Hopefully it combats special interest on the pressure of lawmakers. In other words, just how it started with those railroad tycoons influencing the legislatures in South Dakota and Wyoming, that if the people can put legislation on the ballot, that hopefully it will lessen the influence of special interest on lawmakers. Okay, now we go the opposite way. The disadvantages, and I think a lot of you, if you listen, have heard more of the disadvantages probably. But one of the main things was, and this was brought up just before in the last question, was it does not go through that legislative process, okay, in many aspects. So it does not have the review. It doesn't have somebody looking at the constitutionality of this legislation. Is it actually constitutional? Will it pass the courts if it goes to the Supreme Courts? It doesn't go through that process where hearings, where people can testify on pros and cons. It doesn't always go through that fiscal thing. Is this going to cause a problem? How much money is this going to cost? Is this going to cost the taxpayer? How will it affect the budget? All those things. Petitions and initiatives are also very costly and time consuming. You have to collect a lot of signatures, and you have to come up with that actual wording of that ballot question. So there's a lot of time, a lot of time consuming knocking on doors and things involved. And there is also, even once it goes, there's the idea of pushing your ballot question through. So it's advertising and influencing of voters. Interestingly enough, the initiatives are not subject to campaign finance rules. So that idea with the special interest, and that comes if you see two doors down, 2 marks down, you do get special interests involved that either can write the legislation or are against the legislation written, that have time and money to go to try to make and influence the voters their way. I remember we had one in Florida when I was there, and the initiative was Save the Everglades. And of course, it was brought on by the sugar industry. So, you know, you really have to know who's behind what. Too many voters might be turned off if you have too many. As I said, 32 ballot questions in California, and it was, you've got to be kidding. So, and then I had to laugh because in 2019, when we first started this, what popped up was the potential for disinformation. And of course, we were just starting with things like the FaceTime and all the TikTok and all the media that is now so much in the news and influencing voters. But I thought that was interesting, that that was one that popped up. So those are the advantages and the disadvantages. So how do we combat those? And this is what states have come up with. And that was one thing we were very interested in, because a lot of the initiative process legislation now has been tweaked. So a lot of those disadvantages, or at least some of them, have been mitigated through legislation, or even constitutional requirements. The first one is signature requirements. Is there some level support for the proposed measure? And the signature requirements, if you're first starting, that would be something very interesting to look at. Is it 10% of the voters who are registered? Is it 10% of the voters who voted in the last state, which be gubernatorial election? How do you judge how many signatures you need so that you're sure you have some level of support, but that you're not overburdening the people that are trying to get signatures? And I was looking up, and it was interesting when we did look this up. The courts have increasingly, and I think I looked at least 5 court cases in the Western states where they first started, and the courts rejected any proposal to increase signature requirements, saying that it would be a burden to the people trying to do the initiative, or to the voters who are not being allowed to see or get the initiative on the ballot and be able to vote on it. So at this stage, the courts, as of now, are really clamping down on the original states that are trying to increase the amount of signatures, because they want to make it harder to put initiatives on the ballot. The other thing that is really very important, and I think almost all states have this, is make sure that what's on the ballot is a single subject. And I know when we worked, because the league worked on putting initiatives on the ballot, one of the things we really had to be careful of was that it was just a single subject. If you expanded it too much, it would be unconstitutional. But that's really the way that you want to know if the voters are for or against that initiative that is on the ballot. And I know if you're like us, when you get to the legislature and there's 5,000 things on one piece of legislation, and it can be thrown out because of one little part of it that the legislature doesn't like, all these amendments. This is what they try to avoid with the single subject rule in initiatives. The other thing now is that many states are saying that you have to have an impact on finances prepared by a state official. In other words, what is the fiscal impact on this initiative? And that was not done when I was in California with Prop 13, which really started the initiative process going wild again, where there was elimination of taxes, control over the taxes, and it killed California in many ways. Will there be some kind of fiscal analysis expected on the ballot question? Others is approval of the initiative wording. At the beginning, and many times even in California, we had no idea when we were voting if we were voting for, if it changed it or didn't change it, or if we were voting against, did we get what we wanted or didn't we get what we wanted? So if you're doing any kind of initiative working for getting some kind of laws for initiative, you want to make sure that the description is not misleading to the voters. So there should be some kind of process for that. And a lot of times the state attorney or somebody at that level will look at it and say, yay or nay, will pass it, okay? The writing of the initiative title and summary. Is it clear? Is it accurate? And is the summary fair? Is it not biased one way or the other? And again, this all deals with that description. And are you giving voters the best example of what this legislation is going to do? Are the requirements for passage clear? Is it a majority vote that will pass? Does it need 2/3 of a vote to pass? Just what is the process for getting a clear consensus on that legislative process? I'm just going to do one more because it really goes with the wording and the title, but not quite, and it should be on there. And that is it constitutional? And more requirements for initiatives are that it has to be okayed by state, somebody high in the state office to say this is going to be constitutional, because at the beginning, and the questions were when anybody could write something, if it could go to the courts constantly because they're saying this is not constitutional. So does it meet the state constitution requirements? So as you can see, there are a lot of things that you can do in establishing laws for the initiative that will really key in and make the process fairly workable. Okay, in Virginia, statewide issues requires the legislation to enact by the General Assembly, and voters cannot circulate petitions for any question to appear on the ballot statewide. That's in your Constitution. Okay, but interesting, you have a bond referendum that we do not have. You're allowed to do bond measures for things like school, infrastructure, and utilities. So you're allowed, the state is allowed to see if you want to issue bonds for certain things. So you have something Maryland doesn't have. Okay, as I said, when we were doing this, possible initiatives were redistricting. We looked at, and we are very different. Here's where Maryland differs from you, and we envy Virginia in we are at least trying to get open primaries for unaffiliated voters. We still have the old-fashioned closed primaries where the only people that can vote in the primary, except for Board of Education, are Republicans and Democrats. We have over 20% now in Maryland are unaffiliated voters, and they are locked out of that process in the primary. So, and then Trish said other things, gun control, gun legislation. There are so many things that now it's very, very frustrating because our legislatures are not acting. Okay. And for the General Assembly in Virginia to place measures on the ballot for referred constitutional amendments and the bond measures, they need a simple majority vote in each chamber for 2 successive legislative sessions. I thought that was interesting. With an intervening legislation election is required to refer an amendment to the ballot. So that is a long, long process for you. And a simple majority in each chamber during one legislative chamber for that bond issue. And the signature of the government to appear on the ballot, governor. So I think that constitutional amendment is really pretty convoluted for Virginia. But interestingly enough, like Maryland, the initiative process is available to 4 of the 229 charter municipalities that have exercised their home rule. And they are Hampton, Lynchburg, Norfolk, and Portsmouth. Now, I got 3 of them. I couldn't find Lynchburg. It's small, if any of you from Lynchburg, but we'll look at those 3 and just see where that mitigating that we talked about comes in. Okay, Norfolk, you can do an initiative or referendum powers for city ordinances. Here comes your signature requirements. Equal to 10% of the electors who cast votes in their preceding regular municipal election for council members. The referendum requires 25% of electors, but not fewer than 4,000. The petitioners have 120 days to gather signatures and must get approval of the form, content, and language from the city attorney. So there again is that those mitigating circumstances. If a petition from an ordinance means 10% minimum signature requirement, it goes to the legislature. If the legislature fails to pass the ordinance, and then with those requirements, it will go on the ballot. So at this point, that's the indirect. It's going to go, you petition, it will go to the legislature. If the legislature refuses, it goes back to the voter. Hampton, again, initiative and referendum, 10% of the electoral, the last council meeting. It's very, very similar to the one before. And again, it is indirect. If the legislature fails to pass the ordinance, the second petition is required. And if you get that, it goes on the ballot. The third one is Portsmouth. Here we have 30% of electors in the city voting for governor in the last gubernatorial election. So they're talking about the governor, not the city council, the city administrators. Okay. must be filed within 30 days after the first signature is gathered. And the petition, the information of the petition is determined partially by city code and by the city attorney. So here they're really checking the constitutionality of it. And if it's going to, and if it's successful, it goes to the legislation to pass. If not, it goes back to the voter. So again, all three of those that I checked are indirect, not direct. It has to go back to the voter. So I am going to stop for a minute here and questions, comments, anything you want.
Well, there was a question about the governor being able to override this. So say we put something on the ballot, it passes. We're assuming since the legislature wasn't involved, the governor cannot veto it, or
No.
does?
You're
Okay,
right.
Okay,
The governor if it is an initiative on the ballot, a direct initiative, or even the second part of the direct, the governor or the legislature then has no control.
okay, and I don't know if Maryland, I'm sorry. Sir, I don't know if Maryland is a Dillon state rule, a Dillon rule state. But there is some question about these locals. And if the Dillon rule applies or how they got permission to do it. And I don't know, that might be an unfair question to you since you're in Maryland.
I'm going to go back a few because here, the initiative, it's in the Constitution. This is in your Constitution, that the charter municipalities can exercise their home rule authority. Now, in Maryland, and if any of you were from any of those counties that I mentioned, what happens in Maryland is, say Montgomery, when Montgomery wanted the power of the initiative, okay, since it's a change in the Constitution, what happened is it was two steps. It was on the ballot, and Maryland, Montgomery County had to pass the Constitution question, and the state of Maryland had to pass it too. So it was two steps, and there's usually no problem there, because most of the arguments are, if the local district wants it, why should the rest of the state say no? But I thought that was interesting because Maryland too, if you are a charter municipality, you have certain rights that the others don't. And this is one way of exercising their home rule.
Okay. Okay. Hang on. No, you're just getting a thank you. And the governor, yeah. Okay. So if anybody else has any questions, drop them in chat, please. Yeah, the Dillon rule, by the way, does not go back to the Byrd administration. Dillon rule goes way, 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 way back.
And what is it? Dare I ask?
The Dillon rule says that you cannot, the counties or the cities cannot have authority to do things unless it is specifically granted by the state legislature.
Right, and that's granted already.
And that
their
seems
home
to be
rule
granted.
allows them, if it's enabling legislation. So if you noticed, only 4 actually, said yes to the process, but the local has to initiate that they want it. It's just not given to them. It's enabling. They can have it if they want
That
it.
is correct.
Well, why should they have it? Darn it all! I'm just saying.
Because they're incorporate, or they're
Yeah,
self-governing,
exactly.
basically.
No, I know.
Yes,
I know.
yes. So you need to incorporate, like Maryland, and have yourself a local charter, so that you can keep changing the charter through the legislative process.
Right now, okay. So Carolyn also says, can the citizen initiative be used to override a governor's veto. So I guess if the governor vetoes legislation, you can have a citizen
That
initiative.
would, no, that would be a referendum and you do not, we have the power in Maryland. Virginia does not have that veto referendum power.
Right, but I'm saying if the governor, and Carolyn, if I'm not getting this right, come off mute. So if the governor vetoes a piece of legislation, the General Assembly passes it, the governor vetoes it. And of course, then they can't override it because we do have the 2/3 override, which is hard to get in Virginia because we're so split,
Yes.
we're 50-50. So if the governor vetoes this bill, then can we put an initiative on the next session?
If you get enough signatures,
And
you have to get enough signatures required and it would have to go through the whole process, depending upon what the process is that you have established for getting initiatives.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else have a question on that? On this whole idea? So I've looked at your study, your position. It is very short and sweet.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to now, because you don't.
Oh, okay. I was
okay.
going to put it up, but go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Here is the position we came up with. We support for a change in the Maryland Constitution to allow voters the right to petition for a statutory or constitutional amendment through the initiative process. So they went for, the Maryland League went for both laws and constitutional amendments. They preferred the direct initiative process, which means from the signature right to the ballot. But they would also support indirect if we couldn't get direct. And here's where the mitigating. In preparing enabling legislation, the following practices should be taken into consideration: transparency, single subject, the number and distribution of signatures required, basically, the fiscal implications, oversight of title, summary, and constitutionality of the initiative, and a higher number of signatures should be needed for a constitutional initiative than for a legislative initiative.
So those of you who are new to the league or unfamiliar with LEAD, this was a product of their 2-year study. We could, and it would be up to the members at the convention, decide to do our own 2-year study on this, or we could, if everyone, again, at the convention, the delegates were in concurrence with this, just adopt this, because I would have to look and make sure it would apply to the Virginia Constitution, blah, 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 which, looking at it quickly, I believe it does. Just adopt this, and then this would allow the league to, the Virginia League, to lobby, advocate on behalf of citizens' initiatives. So that's sort of what we're feeling out today, whether this is something we want to do, this is something we're interested in, and then if we have it, of course, then we can advocate on that. Carolyn says the main use I see for initiatives is to address those things that directly address the legislature itself, that are against the legislator's self-interest, such as campaign finance reform. Trish, you have your hand up? Do you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that Virginia, I did an LIS search. Virginia has had 3 bills submitted for establishing a citizens initiative and the veto referendum. They would have allowed legislation, constitutional amendments to be initiated, ballot measures by the citizens with signature requirements. I looked at all 3 after looking through the Maryland report, and they seem to have addressed 2 were indirect, 1 was direct. they seem to have addressed most of these things. They didn't mention single subject, but I think Virginia already has a law that no legislation, all legislation has to be single subject, all bills. But the number of distribution of signatures were ranging between 5 and 8% based on gubernatorial elections, which is pretty reasonable. So there is work to do, but there was something going on in 1994 and 1995 where General Assembly members were willing to consider this. I mean, the bills didn't pass, but I was astonished that they were actually even entertaining giving up some of their power. So just to add that.
Okay. Liz, well, I guess we're at the end. Liz, go ahead.
Real quick. Elaine, knowing Maryland as I do, having grown up there, are you getting any pushback in Montgomery County? Are you getting any pushback in the Maryland on your proposal? The citizens initiative.
We've had it up 3 year, no, yeah, we're not getting anywhere. We're trying.
Just thought I'd ask. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's as I said, what was it, 2019 was the last Mississippi was the last one. Nobody's been able to get that initiative process through. And it keeps coming up in the states, and it whatchamacallit, it just doesn't it doesn't go anywhere because, you know, as you said, and we all said, they're giving up their power, and that's not something they want to do. It's the same as redistricting and some of the other things. It's very hard to get the legislature to, you know, say we're going to give the power to the people.
True. True. Well, we have exactly 3 minutes. Our program director on the state level, Alice Toussignon, yes, we will have slides. I think the slides are already in the file. If not, we will get them in right away. Alice is on a train, which is the reason I'm babbling. But if you have any interest in doing this, you know, let us know. Let Alice know, program at lwv-va.org, pro, con, because this is something we're going to have to look at before the convention and see if we could bring it before the convention, in whether you want to do a study or you want to adopt this. So let Alice know. I will put it in chat again, her email to reach Alice. Let her know the board is meeting on the 8th we're going to have a looking forward to the next 6 months. How do we go? So let Alice know before then. And Trish, thank you for bringing this to the Virginia Lead. And Elaine, gosh, thank you. Thank you for all the work that you've done. It's been amazing.
Thanks, Elaine.
No problem. Any way we can help you out, you know, just let it know. My whole family's in Virginia, so I'll work with you any way I can.
Okay, and shoot me those slides if you would, and I'll get them
I
ready.
will. And at the end of the slide, actually, the last slide I didn't show is I have 3 websites you might want to check, like Ballotpedia and some of those. The state Conference of Governors or something has very good. So there's some good resources out there. So at the end of that slide, there are 3, at least 3 websites that you can at least start with, and then have fun.
Great. Thank you. Thank you again. And we appreciate you coming to talk to us on this beautiful Sunday. And thank you all for showing up.
But we still have time to get out and enjoy.
True. We'll put this up on our YouTube page, and a copy will go out to everybody who RSVP'd. So thank you all. Have a nice afternoon.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Elaine. Bye-bye.